Important update here on UK's second wave. We're going to be asking a very important question. So the UK leadership, based on the current data, is bringing in all kinds of business destroying and cancer diagnosis delaying and mask wearing kind of measures and rule of six. So why are they doing this? So let's look. Here up front I'm going to show you from German data that influenzas in the lines here rise up coming into the autumn period. And we see corona is also rising, right? Because it's a seasonal virus like the influenzas. That's actually pretty normal. And usually we'd keep calm and not panic, especially the British. So this graph, however, was presented at a presentation to the whole of Britain a week and a half ago by these characters. And it showed the cases potentially going up through the roof to 50,000 a day. The reality, of course, as we knew at the time, was that something like this would happen, and indeed did happen, right? Because this is what the science would say. So why did they put this out to the people? What possible purpose? Well, one reason is to fuel or hype a case-demic. We'll explain what that is in a moment. But you need to ask yourself, ask the question of your leadership, why are they doing this? So case-demics, we've had this hysteria in the UK and Ireland and all over Europe actually from June to September 2020. And a case-demic, quite simply, can be shown here. In a real epidemic, you have cases rising and falling by the viral curve, largely independent of lockdowns. And now we have, coming into autumn, cases rising rapidly. But a lot of these are due to false positives, which we'll discuss in a moment. But let's look at the deaths. In the real epidemic, they rose, sadly. The susceptible were affected. But the epidemic was over, really, in May 2020. Let's look now at the impacts in a case-demic. And as you can see, you can barely see them. There's still less than one person per million per day with a positive PCR test sadly passing. So that's a case-demic. This is a very important article, and there are many now, on false positives from the PCR test. So I'll explain. Here we have the epidemic back in March, April. UK is in purple there. That was indeed an epidemic and very sad impacts. Out here at the end of May coming into June, it's no longer an epidemic by any reasonable definition because the impacts are falling right down. But if you keep testing with PCR tests, as the authorities seem to have been pushing, you'll get yourself a case-demic, which we indicated a few minutes ago. Let's look at the PCR tests. If you're doing 10,000 PCR tests in a day, and the UK is doing 250,000, but let's say 10,000, and you get 100 positives, that's kind of scary. And feed these all in, and you got a case-demic. But what if we were scientific, and we thought about the actual data and the science? Well, then we'd realise that 50 to 90 of these, 100, could be false positives at a sensitivity of 99.2%. That's just the math. Another bunch are old fragments of virus from maybe an infection a month or more ago, so they're meaningless as well. You could have trivial positives, genuine fragments of virus, but no transmissibility, and they're going to be gone in a couple of weeks without any transmission, so they're trivial, they don't count for anything. And you will have some concerning positives in there at a very low rate of people who are transmissible or symptomatic and may be relevant. This is the number that should be taken out from the 100 and fed in to the tracking to look at preventative measures if necessary. Then you wouldn't have a case-demic though, really, would you? So you got to ask the question of your authorities, because they're using all 100 here inappropriately, why are they doing this? Because of course, according to the science, they should not be doing this. They should be sifting down to the relevance. The Cornwall case-demic, a quick example of a UK nature. Back in June or so, you had everything opening up again after the epidemic, And there was a lot of hysteria in the press because all these photos were being taken and quite clearly people were getting back to normal. Here's one from Soho, I believe, in that time period. And there was a huge amount of fear. Got a lot of replies validating that a couple of million people poured into Cornwall over the last 3-4 months, and you couldn't even get seats at restaurants. It was packed out. Another interesting thing is 1 in 4 is over 65 in Cornwall, and 1 in 3 are over 65 in Devon. So it's a quite old population, and Devon was packed out too, and Dorset, I believe. So a perfect natural experiment to get empirical data. So what actually happened in this long period of cramming? Was there an ICU spike over the 3 months? No, not in the least. Were there many deaths over the 3 months? Remember, more than 2 weeks. There were 0 deaths, apparently. So this is a perfect example of a case-demic, a natural experiment showing that it's a case-demic. So with this data clear to anyone, you should be asking your authorities, why are they doing this? New lockdowns and masks and all these things. So we show now the epidemic again, Ireland, Sweden, UK in blue. There were 12,000 tests done per day back in the actual epidemic in the UK. And now there's around 250,000 a day. That's one huge driver for the case-demic. More than 20 times more testing than April. In terms of cases, there were 700 back here when the tracking started July. These are PCR positives being called cases, but they're not cases. As I mentioned to you, they're PCR positives, viral fragments. Cases are people who are symptomatic or hospitalized. So that's a big obfuscation. But anyway, it's up to 7,100 of these so-called cases. So that's very scary. Let's remove now and look at the impact again, coincident with all of these cases. And we can see that almost nothing is happening. Around 0.6 deaths per million people per day in the UK carrying some viral fragments. Let's project out. What should we expect to see in this scenario? Well, some people are saying or pushing that we could see this and justifying new measures and rules of 6 and God knows what else. People like this. But in reality, the science would suggest we'd see something like this coming into the winter, right? Mortality like prior years. So let's bring in Spain, who's ahead of the game and one of the worst affected coming into autumn in Europe, and France. And let's take the Spanish pattern, because they're ahead of the UK, and we'll translate or bring it across to the UK. And hey presto, it follows the science, what the science would expect. France will do the same, project across. Yeah, it predicts what the science will predict too. The science predicts this, and usually we make interventions, particularly economy-destroying ones, and ones that risk many, many more lives than will ever die from SARS-CoV-2. When we make measures like that, we use science. So you ask your leadership, why are they doing this kind of stuff? Right? That's an important question. I'll show another view here. Recently, the figures have shown around 60 to 70 per day in the latter days in the UK, deaths with SARS-CoV-2. But if you look at the date of death, right, the corrected data from the database, it's a very different picture of a slow rise. And if you project out, again, you would expect to see a relatively normal rise of respiratory mortality coming into the winter. And with all the hyper-testing, you're going to see a lot of SARS-CoV around too. But again, you would keep calm and not panic, given that that's the expectation. But it seems the leadership is trying to insinuate some kind of picture like this and justify further economy and society destroying measures, making up a lot of scary stuff. In science, anything could happen, but you plan and you implement cost-benefit checked measures based on what the science says, not the scary way out there stuff. So again, you got to ask your leadership, Why are they doing this? I'm going to show you now very interesting data from Ollie Shepherd, sent this on to me. And we can see here, looking at week 1 to week 38, encompassing the epidemic period, the blue or purpley colour is SARS-CoV-2. And indeed, sadly, it caused a lot of mortality in the susceptible. We'll show Sweden in comparison, who had no lockdown. And it's very similar. They actually did better than the UK as it happened. The epidemic was over around here by any sane person standards, week 27, so we'll remember that date. And we'll go and look at the graph of all respiratory mortality in the UK from the database, right, excluding COVID. And again, this is the purple. So we don't have the COVID spike here, we've taken it out. So the purple here is lower than the 5 previous years for the last few months. So we'll add back in COVID from when the epidemic was over. We'll add back in the COVID to see the total respiratory mortality and compare with the last 5 years. Up until this point, today. Wow, this is what we see. It's indistinguishable from the prior 5 years. But hold on a minute, we've been doing suppression measures like never before in history for all of this 4 months. How on earth can the respiratory mortality overall be the same as the prior years and not in the least be affected by all of these economy and society undermining measures? That's a huge question, and I think I know the answer, and many of you do too, that these measures are not really impacting any real-world outcomes. If we project out here, we see that we can expect a rise in mortality due to respiratory. Absolutely, as per prior years. And that would be normal. Sad as it is for the aged or the comorbid who are affected most, that would be actually normal. So we need to watch like a hawk and see if something untoward happens or if this is what we see. And again, you got to be asking your leadership, why are they doing this stuff with lockdowns and measures, given what is screaming at us from the actual data? So we'll finish with UK and Sweden again, because Sweden are the world leaders in epidemic management. They've clearly proven that. And we'll look at one last scenario. Sweden, CNN visited Stockholm, the epicenter, on May the 6th, right in their epidemic. And they videoed people getting their hair cut. The schools up to age 16 were all open, no masks. People were asked to stay arm's length in restaurants, and they did, I guess. And people who had symptoms stayed at home. But this video showed a pretty normal life in the epidemic. Right? They did better than the UK. You might wonder, how are they looking in the past few weeks? How about this? These are photos taken from the past few weeks in Sweden. Life is very much back to normal. As I say, they're the masters in epidemic management. Here's a couple more pictures. Does it look good to you compared to the UK and what's going on? They're even in the tube trains. Not a mask in sight. The British used to be pretty reasonable and pretty tough and good managers of crises. Won the war and all that. So what's gone wrong? Why are they now bringing in many, many measures that are damaging society, economy, causing delays in cancer and other treatments, and wreaking havoc over the long term? What happened to them? Why are they doing that? And I'd suggest you use this hashtag as you present data like this in the future. Data showing, like the published paper from Birmingham University today, that lockdowns don't work, right? When you're sending out that data, consider adding the hashtag. Why are they doing this? Thanks for listening, guys. And just a reminder that I do need support to continue putting together all of this content. And at patreon.com/Ivor Cummins, or for PayPal at tinyurl.com/Ivor Cummins, where you can do a one-off or a monthly support. So I'd really appreciate that, guys, and keep me getting the science out there and countering perhaps the more biased corporate type science. Thank you.